All right, so welcome to the Brisbane Azure User Group. It's great for everybody to turn up. First of all, big thank you out to our sponsors. Codify chip in all the cash and Microsoft provide the facilities for this. Without these guys, this is not possible, right? So big thank you to these guys. They're really good. And if you ever need any help, Codify are great people. They can absolutely help you out with any sort of stuff you need. So getting involved in this community, this is not about being an expert in Azure. I'm definitely not an expert, right? Anybody can get involved in this. We have a long list of opportunities. And personally, I love tonight's topic because I've been wanting that for a long time. Like, how are you using Azure? It's not just about Azure itself. It's about what are you using Azure to achieve and how are you doing that? So seeing Xamarin running on Azure, that's amazing. A lot of people get a lot of value out of those experiences that we all have because you want to say that they always go fine and they're always easy, right? It's never the case. That's a complete lie. If anyone ever tells you that, they're lying to you. They never are easy. But anyway, if you've got a topic, let us know. There's an email there. We want to hear from you. It doesn't have to be the latest and greatest of Azure. In fact, I'd rather it's not. It's more about what are some Azure things that you're using that have been around for 5 years? How are you using it? What are you doing? Let us know. We want to hear from you. So, job opportunities. I'm flicking this over to Dan.
If you're looking for a new adventure, we got Deloitte, most well known for its auditing and tax and financial stuff. But the biggest part in the business is actually our consulting. And we have a core business operations unit, which does all kinds of cloud integration. So if you've got skills in that area and a passion for doing integration, we'd love to hear from you.
If you want to learn, Deloitte's a great place. So a few updates. I know last month you saw a whole bunch of Gartner things. Well, there was another one that we missed out on. The IoT platforms. Microsoft's rated really highly in IoT platforms, and the IoT solution from Microsoft is very comprehensive and pretty easy to use. So there's a private preview out. This one looks really cool. So this is a bit of an AI thing. If you're in the space of looking at video, and this one's about finding where clothing appears in the video that matches the clothing that you may want to sell. So it's all about advertising. If you're trying to get videos and you're trying to position ads at the right point in time, but what's that right point in time to break out to an ad? How do you get the most relationship between the actual video and the items of clothing you're selling? I thought that was pretty cool. So Azure Storage Mover, it's just an FS share to Azure Blob, but this is a new tool that they've developed to do storage moves at scale. So it's all about scale, right? So if you've just got a couple of files, it's not the tool for you. If you've got a couple of million files or more and petabytes of data geographically dispersed around the world, well, this is something that can help you move that data from your own custom data centers up into Azure. Landing zones for integration services. So we've got a bit of identity and access, network topology, connectivity, security, management, governance, and platform automation for DevOps. The landing zones concept is there to help organizations structure Azure in a fairly consistent, reliable way where they can have confidence in the outcome. So when we're now dealing with integration services, this landing zone is going to help guide that setup and give you a good confidence in how you're using Azure.
I'm curious, how many people here have used integration services in Azure? I think one person. Integration, it's hard, right?
That's an understatement. It's not hard. It's really hard.
So Azure gives you a whole huge toolbox of things that enable integration to work really, really well. And this landing zone helps you get kick-started with it and figure out what services to use. It's not only just being able to deploy stuff, but there's a lot of guidance in there as well.
We got some backup for SAP HANA. The important thing to point out with the backups was that they're now certified, so it's now a certified solution, and it's called backint. So it's using all the appropriate APIs and integration points to do those backups. You can do that partial restore to files as ad hoc backups and integration with other tools. If you're using SAP, it's pretty important. MySQL, the flexible service SKU, they've now got Azure AD. So if you want to leverage Azure AD in MySQL, that's now available. It's GA. And now there's also bring your own key with customer managed key for your data encryption. So if you want to do your data encryption yourself and you don't want the platform to do that for you and you want to manage those keys, absolutely can now with SQL. By the way, that's not something you should do. That's something I heavily advise against. You can. And we also have the same customer managed keys for Postgres as well. So not in Australia, but you can do it elsewhere. Azure Arc enabled container apps. Now you can put Azure container apps on Azure Arc. If you do want to have that independence from the Azure data center, you can now do the container apps, which is pretty cool. Cosmos DB V2 connector for Power BI. So this allows you to do queries across the wire rather than doing the full data. So that's moving all that data. If you have big data sets, that's not great. Now it allows you to do the queries across the wire rather than the full data sets. So we've got an Azure Slack channel. If you guys are interested, jump on the Slack. We've got YouTube, so hopefully this will be on not very long, but it's not streamed. And a bit of training resources. There's some really good Pluralsight authors here. They will tell you how good Pluralsight is. I don't need to tell you that. So if you want to learn something, it's a great place. And the 30 days to learn, it's really good too. And tonight, without any further ado, welcome Derek. So Derek is a mobile developer that's been working in the industry for a very long time. And tonight, we're going to learn about Derek's experience with Xamarin and Azure and a whole bunch of scalable Azure products.
Thank you very much, Damien. My name's derekvantonder. Thank you very much to Damien and to Dan for hosting it. I'll say again, they do a really great unrecognized job of putting all this together. And thank you very much to the Microsoft guys for basically sponsoring it as well. I would call myself a senior Xamarin developer. I have used Xamarin a lot, and my history and my background is I came into Xamarin from the perspective of desktop apps and WPF and XAML almost 10 years ago now that I think about it. So most people are probably not that familiar with Xamarin. The perspective I'm giving in this talk is what it's like to start a Xamarin project that's backed by an Azure backend, and more importantly, what the decisions were that I made, because one of the most important things I wanted to do with this project is to allow it to scale to 100 million users. The thought that I had when I started the project is, what if my project goes viral? If, say, 100 million people want to use it overnight, it's possible. But if my code fell over, if I couldn't scale to that number of users, to me, that'd be like dropping a winning lottery ticket down a drain. From the beginning of the project, these were the choices I was making. It was much more difficult to make it scale. Making an app that can run for 1,000 users is pretty easy. Making an app that can run for 100 million users is a whole different kettle of fish. That's why I chose to use Azure, and that's what I'm going to be talking about, is the story of how that all happened. My perspective on this is I'm just a guy developing a project basically in my bedroom. But what I found amazing about my journey on this project was I was able to do things that I think you probably would have needed a whole team of people for 10 years ago. So that to me was pretty awesome. I just want to very quickly give you guys my bio and tell you a little bit about my background. I actually started out in the games industry as a C++ developer up until about 2012. Then I began using C Sharp and the .NET framework. This was all before Azure even existed. So I was one of the very earliest adopters of C Sharp. It's a beautiful language. After that, I worked in virtual reality. That was a C Sharp gig as well. We did a lot of C Sharp using Unity engine. I did some augmented reality and geospatial modeling work as well, working with very large data sets. I also did a bit of web development with ASP.NET and HTML recently. I've been mainly focused on mobile development for this little passion project of mine. And the last thing I want to say is my favorite cloud backend solution is Azure. And there's a very, very simple reason for that. It's because it has fantastic documentation, fantastic tutorials. And for someone like me who's just a guy working in my bedroom, that's invaluable. I don't have a team of highly paid consultants to tell me what I should and shouldn't be doing. I just kind of had to figure it out by myself. But the documentation was that good that I was able to do it. So let's get into my project. It's called Mental Wealth Press. So the idea of Mental Wealth Press is that it's a publishing platform that introduces a new type of content that content creators can sell. And that new type of content is the video book. So imagine if Kindle ebooks and TikTok had a baby. That's what my app is. So I've basically fused together that very popular 9:16 portrait short video format that you see everywhere today with ebooks. I've used Xamarin to develop everything except the video player. And there's a reason for that. It was because I knew I wanted the project to scale. And that meant potentially storing data, quite a lot of data for maybe 100 million users. I needed something incredibly powerful. I needed something incredibly scalable, but I also needed something in my own language, C Sharp, which I could easily use and very quickly get off the ground with. That's why I chose Xamarin and the Azure stack. There are many, many different stacks that you could have used for a project like this. You could use React Native, you could use Flutter, you could use Swift. You could use, there's even some more exotic ones like Kotlin, I think quite a lot of people use in Australia. Xamarin is actually one of the less used mobile app development frameworks. It's probably our number 5. I actually find that really sad, and I think that if more people use it, they would really enjoy it because it's very nice. It has beautiful debugging tools, great documentation. More importantly, it plugs into Azure very neatly. And there's actually a huge amount of documentation around using Azure in Xamarin. So Microsoft have done a great job on that. And for a guy in my bedroom like me, that made my job a lot easier. This is a very complicated architectural diagram I did. I get the worst imposter syndrome when I do things like this, like seriously the worst. This diagram came after I made the project. This wasn't like a designed project. I just kind of added pieces on as I needed them. But when I sat down as the project matured and I did this diagram, I was like, wow, this is like some serious senior solutions architect stuff that I've done here. That's pretty awesome. But the important point here is I wouldn't have been able to do all this without the nice documentation and tutorials I was able to find for Xamarin and Azure. So that made my job a lot easier. And the fact that I've been writing code for like 20 years also obviously made it a bit easier. My application is either an iOS or Android Xamarin app. So those are deployed from my Mac. You can also deploy from a PC if you want. But if you want to make an iOS app with Xamarin, you have to have a Mac. There is absolutely no way of getting around it. You can get a remote desktop cloud in Mac thing, but it's terrible. Please don't do that. The interesting thing is that the code base is 90% the same for those two platforms in my app. What that means is it saved me a hell of a lot of time because I didn't have to write my project twice for two platforms. Only about 10% of the code is platform specific. The only thing you need to take away from that is it's a massive time saver. You write most of your code just once. You only really have to adjust for differing screen sizes using flexible layouts, and then you're mostly done. Yes. I use Xamarin Forms, yes, that's right. So a lot of people have been asking, oh, do you use Maui? Do you use Xamarin Forms? I'm going to be upgrading to Maui soon. So Maui, it's a very long technical explanation that I don't want to get into, but it's the next iteration of Xamarin where all of the platform-specific things are smooshed into one project. And there's interesting things with support for Blazor WebAssemblies, which I am not even going to talk about because I really don't know a lot about it. But it is very interesting if you're doing data entry heavy apps. That's project number 1. Project number 2 is the Azure Functions API. That sounds like a massive project, but it's actually a very small project because all it's doing is it's just interfacing with my database and saving user data. So when somebody registers, I'm saving some of the details, like what's their email address, things like that, which books they've purchased, or how many pages I've read. When I say bits and pieces, there is no such thing as bits and pieces when you have 100 million users. That's a vast amount of data. Every little thing in this app, you have to think about, can it scale if there's 100 million people? The answers you get when you start posing that question on every function are very interesting. So that's one of the reasons why I chose Azure Serverless. Typically, if you have a bunch of functions doing things in your database, you have a server. Let's say you get a lot of new customers. Now you need 10 servers. Let's say you go viral overnight. Oh, crap, you need 1,000 servers. The problem is you're paying for all those servers. But the beautiful thing with Azure Serverless is it automatically scales. You're not constantly provisioning servers and saying, oh, damn, I need more servers. It does all of that for you automatically based on how many hits you're getting on your app. So that's a beautiful thing. And SQL Elastic Pool gives you that on the database end as well. If you do it right, and if you spend a few hours making sure you calibrate everything correctly, you can have a scenario where you can handle 100 million users and your app won't fall over. Microsoft have enough capacity to handle it, provided you do your homework and set everything up right in the first place. So the question was, are there parts that can be used offline in the app? No, not in my app, but there are ways of doing that with Xamarin that are quite well explored and well known. I chose not to do it for my app purely because I didn't have the time to implement it. Because my app is so heavy on video, it doesn't really make sense to offer an offline option. You'd be storing gigabytes of video on someone's phone, and that's not cool with most people. I don't know if Apple even lets you do that. That's a really good question. Can you keep reading the book afterwards? Unfortunately not. And for the same reason that you can't keep watching TikTok or YouTube in the Kimberleys. When you start dealing with these vast streaming video files, it becomes very difficult to store it locally on the person's device. I had to make that decision. It's not ruling out that I might let you cache it later. Like when I use Audible to listen to books, they do let you save it on your phone, but I had to keep the scope small because it was just me. So the third project I wrote was an encoder and uploader utility because the existing video hosting solutions like YouTube makes you use ads. I didn't want that. Vimeo absolutely destroys the quality of your videos when you upload, and it's for a reason. They want all the video files to be small. I didn't want that either. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. So I settled on using DigitalOcean with my own custom FFmpeg encoding solution. I'm not actually going to talk about that because it's not really the topic of this talk, but happy to take questions on that afterwards. What I've done is I've duplicated how TikTok encodes their videos. I kind of reverse engineered exactly what codecs and stream rates and all that jazz, and I just did the same thing as them. The fourth project is a Word document conversion utility. So one of the big things about my app is it should be very easy for authors to use. All you need is a Word doc and some videos you make with your phone. That's it. So basically, you're just replacing paragraphs in your book with your videos. My little encoder utility takes that Word doc and it converts it into the video book format, which is my format that I've created. That's actually a much bigger project than it sounds like, because changing a Word document into video tiles with text, it's crazy, but it works really well, and I'm very pleased with it. Finally, I have an interesting one. How many people have used Azure Static Web Apps in this audience? One person. Azure Static Web Apps is absolutely slept on. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. To me, it's really, really cool because there's so many places where you can host web pages. There's heaps of places. But the beautiful thing about Azure Static Web Apps is the ease of use. You push to Git and your website gets deployed. There's no effing around with FTP. None of that's necessary. You just push to Git. I love that about it. It just works. It's great if you're just starting out on a small project. But there's other benefits to it too, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Yes, I have a question. What do I use for notifications? In my app, I currently don't have full-blown notifications. I just haven't gotten to them yet. What I've used is Xamarin's local notifications feature just to remind people, because part of my app is a voice recognition system where you can repeat things and it grades you based on how well you say it. Remote notifications is a big thing. You got to really get in there and there's servers involved. So I haven't gotten to that yet. So let's talk a little bit about why I made the decision to use Azure and Xamarin in the first place. I've already touched on how there's React, there's Flutter, there's Swift, there's Amazon S3, there's Google Firebase or whatever it's called. There's so many solutions, but really the main reason I used this was because I use C#. I like C#. I've already mentioned I used Azure because I wanted to enable hyperscaling. You can do it on other cloud platforms, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult to integrate with Xamarin and C#. Because I use Xamarin, everything was much easier if I used Azure. The platform integration makes your life easier. So I could make a whole talk just on Entity Framework and how good it is. Suffice to say, if you're saving any data in a database, try Entity Framework, put the time into it. I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised once you get it. Like once it clicks, you'll be like, oh, this is actually very powerful. This is a really elegant solution to all of these patchworks that other people have done. Okay. Now, my children helped me pick these memes, so I take no responsibility for what's in this slide. When you're working on a project by yourself, it can be tough. So these are the top things that made me cry in 2022 when I was working on this project. The first one is that you need to understand if you're doing iOS and Android, or possibly other platforms, because Xamarin now lets you do desktop apps as well and all kinds of apps. I believe you can even do Apple Watch and wearables apps now, although I haven't explored that. You have to understand that 2 platforms isn't twice as hard, it's 4 times as hard. You're squaring the difficulty because of context switching. You don't just press a button to switch from an Android to an Apple. It doesn't work that way. You have to load a different simulator. Part of your code might have to change. There's so much context switching. So if you're starting out your project, think very carefully. It might seem like it's just a free extra to support all those platforms. It ain't. You really have to slow down and think, hey, do I want to run on Android? Is that even a market where I might make money for my app? Is that something I need? Or it might be the opposite. Maybe all of your users are exclusively Android users. Maybe you're developing an embedded app in a mining machine that's only Android. Then you don't want to do Apple. It's a complete waste of your time. You can add platforms later on relatively easily. So you're not set in stone by any means. But do think carefully about it. If I had to do this again, I probably would have only done it for iOS. I know this is probably a very Android-heavy user audience. Sorry, guys. I know you love your Androids. But the reality is I'm also a businessman when I'm doing this. I have to think, what's the biggest market in terms of profit? And the Apple App Store dwarfs the Google Play Store in terms of money made by developers. So this is a curly one that you maybe won't run into unless you actually start developing. But this made me cry. Xamarin relies on Xcode on Mac. You have to get your Xcode configured. Just make it deploy an app. That's all you got to do. Make it deploy an app. You're going to learn things about how you've screwed up your system setup. You haven't installed this thing. You haven't installed that thing. It's a whole Apple thing. You've got to go through it. It's like an initiation ritual if you want to get code on an iPhone. Sorry, guys. It's just how it is. It's like joining the Spartans. You don't just become a Spartan. You don't just sign up to be a Spartan. You have to go and run 100 miles and defeat a wolf first. It's very much like that, right? Talking more about history now. I mentioned this before about you should really spend the time, if you want to use Entity Framework, spend the time to learn how it works. You're not going to get it just by watching a YouTube video. You do have to put a little bit of effort into it. I didn't actually cry for this one. Nearly did, but once I got how it worked, I was like, oh, now I get it. And then everything became much easier. You do have to invest a little bit of time. It's not just a hello world thing. There's a whole reason that it's been made the way it is. Once you learn that, you're going to be good and you're actually going to be very productive with it. I'm using Azure SQL serverless, which means that I have access to this tremendous amount of storage and processing, huge amounts of it if I want. But I'm still just really at one simultaneous user right now because I'm developing it, right? What happens is every hour you get billed for CPU usage, even if your CPU is sitting idle. And this is normal. It's very much the same in all cloud platforms. But what I've done is I've enabled something called auto pause to save myself a bit of money during the early development because I'm not working on the app every single day. That actually automatically turns off your server, which is nice because then it's not billing you. You're not paying for it during those moments. So if you're on holiday, you're paying zero, which is great. But the downside of that, and something you need to be aware of and plan around a little bit, is if you then go and show a venture capital person who you want to fund your company, your app, it's not going to work for the first 60 seconds because of the cold start. Your server is busy getting fired up. Resources are being provisioned. You have to be aware of that. So for example, for this talk, the simple workaround is just schedule when you want it to be on. For this talk, I've turned off auto pause. I'll probably turn it on again tomorrow when I go home because then I know it's unlikely I'm going to need it for the next 12 hours or so. And when I'm at home, I don't care. I'm willing to wait. But just be aware of it when you're developing, especially if you're giving demos like this. You don't want to make it look like your app's not working because of something silly like that. That won't really exist in production. Finally, I kind of mentioned this before. Publishing apps onto the App Store is hard. It's not easy. It never will be because of how Apple does all their certificates. You do have to invest time to study how that stuff works. Unless you want to pay someone a large amount of money, you do need to study it. You need to read the Apple docs. You need to read the excellent Xamarin documentation on how to actually use it properly. Apple's docs are very high level, written by these crazy guys with 17 degrees. But the Xamarin ones I find are actually much more practical. It's like, okay, Apple says this, but you actually have to do that, and then you have to do this to make it work. It's actually really awesome. Okay, so now more positive things. Here's some wins and some useful things I learned during this project. How many people know what MVVM means or have used it? Okay, we've got a couple. It seems like there's two sides to this audience tonight. So I'm mainly going to speak to these guys, okay? So MVVM is the view model framework. When I first started using it, I didn't really get it. I was like, this is so complicated. WTF? Why are we doing things this way? It doesn't make sense. But then somebody came and showed me that, like, no, it's because you need the separation of concerns. MVVM means you have a model, which is just a C# class with some data in it. Very, very basic C# class. That model goes in your database. You have a coder who can be in charge of just that. Then you have the view model, which is a piece of C# code that interprets that data. For example, it takes a number and it converts it into a slider. That's one example of how you could use the view model. The view model is very intelligent, but it doesn't know anything about the view. The view is a piece of XAML. And that piece of XAML can be done by another separate dude. Maybe he's like your UX designer. But the important point is you can have 3 different people doing this potentially. And that separation of concerns is actually really good for you because it means that people who are good at one thing, e.g. graphic design, are very unlikely to be good at this other thing, database administration. The overlap between those two is not a Venn diagram. It's like 2 needles pointing at each other. I don't know if you've ever met a great graphic designer / SQL genius, because I haven't. Anybody? No, they're typically totally different poles on the career spectrum. So having the separation of concerns is fantastic because it means you can have multiple disciplines working on your user interface and on the back end. So that's what MVVM is all about. Put the time into it to learn how to do it properly. There's fantastic tutorials. Another thing I recommend is trying Fresh MVVM. So Fresh MVVM it's basically takes MVVM, which is hard to say. It takes MVVM and makes it even simpler and easier to use. It was written by a guy in Sydney. His name is Michael Ridland. I can highly recommend it. It just makes MVVM a little bit simpler and a little bit more like what you would do in ASP.NET. So you're navigating from model to model rather than from page to page. It's a much more elegant way of using MVVM. Check it out if you're doing any of that kind of work. I'm definitely a Windows boy. I've been using Windows since the late 1990s. But recently, I was kind of forced to get a Mac because I wanted to publish to the App Store, and you cannot do it without a Mac. I discovered that the new M1 chip Macs, they're actually one of the best development machines money can buy right now. They are sensational. The battery life is insane. They're so energy efficient. They're very powerful machines. And because I do a lot of work with video and encoding lots of videos, that is insanely fast on Macs. They have easily the fastest video encoding on the planet. So if you're doing any of that kind of work, don't even bother with a Windows machine. I mean, if you like having a jet engine on your desk, be my guest. But everybody else, even a lot of people at Microsoft are starting to use Macs for this reason. So another one I really like to mention to people is Visual Studio is great and fantastic, wonderful tool chain. But I like to use JetBrains Rider purely for the really nice IntelliSense and refactoring it has. So JetBrains Rider is an IDE that sits on top of the Microsoft tool chain. You're still using the Microsoft compilers, the Microsoft debuggers and all that. It's just a slightly more intense and much more powerful than IntelliSense is the way I would describe it. So I'm actually very surprised Microsoft hasn't acquired JetBrains because their Rider product is insane. Definitely worth a try. And the nice thing is it gives you a little bit of a different development experience, but you're still using the same tool chain. You're still using the same compilers, literally the same SRN and CSProc files. I wish I had ChatGPT when I began this project because it has been so helpful to me. It's like having the world's greatest senior god-tier developer just sitting next to you telling you, oh, you missed that. Oh, no, you could write that loop better. Oh, have you thought about calling that function instead? Basically, it's like the entire corpus of knowledge on Stack Overflow put into something that you can have a conversation with. If you haven't tried it for development, you are falling behind. Seriously, just try it. If you get a weird compiler error you can't figure out or something like that, just stick it in ChatGPT and say, hey, here's my function. Here's the error I'm getting. WTF, what's going on here? Just do that, and you'll be amazed what it tells you. It'll be like, oh, you need to do this and that. It's basically taking all of Stack Overflow and making it into something you can talk to. So for devs, you guys are seriously sleeping on it if you're not using it. I wish I'd had it at the beginning of the project. It would have made a lot less crying. One other thing I wanted to mention is that Microsoft has this great product. Once again, a lot of people are sleeping on this. Active Directory B2C. Now, one thing I'll talk about later is when you want to write a scalable app, everything has to scale. Everything, including your authentication. That has to scale too. Otherwise, you've got a brick wall. Doesn't matter how great all your other scaling is if people can't even log in. So Active Directory B2C is basically a hyper-scalable version of Active Directory. And for me, on my app, it lets people just log in with Google, just log in with Facebook, just log in with Twitter. When people first install your app, you'd be amazed how many people just drop out and never use it because they can't log in or they don't feel like creating a password. But if you just say just log in with Google, Facebook, Twitter, they will just tap that. 95% of the time, they're just going to tap that. What's happening is you're retaining more users. It's a business thing. You're gaining market share over guys who think that it's cool to make people put in passwords in 2023. Top tip of the day, it's not cool. Don't do that. Please don't do that. There is the option to have a password if people really want to create a password, but you really want to de-emphasize that. Put it at the bottom of the page. Make it less easy to find. So that flows nicely into this one. Once again, this was a product I hadn't even heard about in the Azure Stack until somebody mentioned it to me. They were like, hey, have you tried Active Directory B2C? And I was like, oh, why would I use Active Directory, dude? I'm not working on an enterprise server here. This isn't, a Fortune 500 company. This is like a TikTok competitor app. And he's like, no, you don't understand. This is a scalable authentication solution that lets you use different identity providers like Google and Facebook. But the important key word there is scalable. It can really ramp up if you want. The best reason to use ADB2C is because you are bad at security. There is no way anyone in this room is going to be better at security than a $500 billion company with God knows how many PhDs working on hashing passwords and stuff. You're never going to be better. Just face it. You shouldn't be storing passwords in your database. Please don't do that. That's a terrible idea. You're always going to be doing it worse than Microsoft or Google or Amazon. What you should be storing is an OID that Microsoft gives you. It's not a password hash, but it is a unique identifier that says, this person is derekvantonder@gmail.com. And that might have been confirmed by Google, for all you know. It doesn't matter. You've got a really strong authentication solution, and it's scalable. You don't have to worry. 100 million users, no problem. The other beautiful thing about it is it lets you really eliminate that registration wall that I talked about earlier, where it's, oh, do I have to make a password? When you're not mentioning the cost. The cost is the best thing. Thank you, Damien. Yes, the best thing about it is the cost. The first 50,000 sort of concurrent users that are entered are free. So what that means is that you can develop your app get it off the ground, prove the minimum viable product and all that jazz without basically paying anything for it. And once you do get serious user traction, the fee is really minimal. Considering the security and all the nice security integration things it gives you, I think it's a real winner. I've touched on Azure Static Web Apps before. Definitely slept on. People don't understand how cool this is. Being able to just deploy through a git commit, that fits naturally into my development workflow. I don't want to have to go and F around with an FTP client. I just want to press a button. I don't need something complex. I want something very simple for that. So Static Web Apps is fantastic for that. I highly recommend checking it out before you go on GoDaddy.com or S3 or whatever. It does support custom domains. You can have a free SSL certificate if you want. So I was actually able to wire Static Web Apps up to my custom domain, mwpress.net. It's HTML, CSS, and static content. The other thing that's important to understand about Static Web Apps is that it has this great command line emulator that you can run on your own machine to pretend that you're actually talking to the Azure server when you are developing your app. You've got full security, you've got full HTTPS, you can test out your authentication, everything locally on your own machine, which to me is pretty awesome. Normally you have to connect to a bunch of servers. It's a bit of a nightmare, but the Static Web Apps command line client is really neat. I highly recommend looking into it if you're doing anything related to serving static web content. So the important word here is static. So my app doesn't have a lot of forms and a lot of database back and forth. Mine is mainly static, so it works really well for me. For dynamic apps, you need to be looking at Azure web apps, proper full-blown web apps. But they need a lot more CPU power. They're a different kind of web app to what I've been developing here. So this is really getting into the real heart of the talk. Azure scaling considerations. In your Azure Functions, a lot of people don't know about this, but when you're writing Azure Functions, sometimes you're going to get these weird compiler errors saying, oh, this function needs to be an async function because you're using a wait. It's very common, especially if you're doing ASP.NET, but specifically with Azure Functions. But a lot of people don't understand the background of why it's implemented that way, the reason behind it all. It's not just so you can be a cool multi-threaded developer. That's not the reason. When you're using the await keyword, during that await, if your server is going off and chatting to the SQL server, oh, there's a 3,000 millisecond wait, it's sitting there. That's actually consuming a worker thread on your server. And you're paying for those worker threads. It's all billed. So you don't want to be using it if you can avoid it. The beautiful thing with using the await keyword properly, as much as you can, is that it frees up those worker threads. And when the worker threads are freed up, while they're waiting for the SQL server to figure out, how many tables to give back, it can go and serve somebody else. It's a lot more efficient. And that also means that your users are going to find that the website is much more responsive under load. So you're not going to see this when you have 1,000 users, but you're definitely going to see the impact of that little keyword when you have 100 million users. Then it becomes absolutely essential. Everything has to be awaited. I mentioned this before, but a lot of people don't realize that your authentication also needs to scale. This is super important. There's no point in having the greatest, most optimized database system in the world if the front door is locked and people can't get in. And that's what your authentication is. It's the front door of your app. If you're using somebody else's super powerful service to do it, it's going to reflect very well for those first 10 to 30 seconds people spend with your app. It's like when you first meet a person, the first 10 seconds they say are absolutely crucial. People make judgments based on that. It's no different to apps. So why not let somebody else handle all the details? Somebody with a lot more money than you, and you do what you're good at, which is designing your own app. One other really important thing is to run a load tester on your app. A lot of people never do this, and then they get surprised when they get bad reviews on the App Store saying, oh, I couldn't log in or whatever. There are plenty of great commercial load testers out there. You're going to pay a little bit of money, a couple $100 for it, if you get a really good one. Maybe not. Damien, you're probably more of an expert on this than me. But it doesn't matter which one you use. Just hammer it. Just hammer your app, hammer your website. Make sure that it can actually handle the load that you think it can handle. This is a really important step, because you can write as much scalable code as you want and use all the greatest cloud infrastructure, but you're still going to get surprises. So the load tester, think of it as test-driven development for scaling. Another one I've seen commercial apps doing is every time their user logs in, they're saving something to the database, or they're hitting their database every single time a user logs in. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is a bad idea. If you have 1,000 users, it's okay. Your database can handle it. If you have 100 million users, not okay. You're going to be spending, baby. You're going to be spending so much money. And for what? What business value to you does a user login have? Nothing. Zero. Zilch. A user creating a login has business value because that's a new user. But a user logging in, very little, decreasing business value. So why are you paying for it? Ask yourself this question: why am I paying? Why am I making my database work its ass off for something that's not really earning me money? What you should be doing is avoiding that initial login database hit at all costs. In my app, what I've done is, and this is the beautiful thing about Active Directory B2C, I don't have to hit the database because I have a token sitting on the device after they've logged in the first time. And the code just says, is this token still valid for like 4 weeks or something? It'll still be valid. 99% of the time, I don't have to hit the database. That's the beautiful thing about it. There's nothing required. Everything's authenticated. Everything's good. I'm not hitting the database in the first login. Now, I'm no Azure expert, I'm no cloud expert, but to me, this seemed like a really obvious thing, avoiding all these database hits that you don't really need. One reason that people do this is because they want analytics and logging of what people are doing in their app, and they want to track, like, how many people are opening this book, how many people are doing this, how many people are pressing that button. And that is really good. It's very important on bigger apps to have that, because if you're spending time developing a portion of your app that nobody uses, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your money. But there are better solutions for doing that than hitting your database all the time. I recommend Microsoft's App Center. App Center is designed for that kind of work. App Center doesn't care if you hit it every time someone logs in. It's built for that. You're not going to pay millions of dollars for it. It's literally built specifically to help you with that stuff. And that's what I recommend if you need to do logging or any kind of analytics or user tracking like that. One other thing you need to be aware of, if you want to build a hyper-scalable app, a lot of the time hyper-scalability doesn't come from you. It comes from users creating content for you. For example, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. YouTube is not paying people to make videos, or very few people get paid. TikTok doesn't pay almost anybody to make videos. People make their own content. With that comes problems. You have the problem of tainted content, content you don't want on your platform, undesirable content. I'm sure you can use your imagination. You need to think carefully about that when in the design phase of your app. Is it even worth it for you to have that? Maybe it would be better to have a curated set of content creators making the content for you. It's really a business decision you have to make, but it has other implications for scaling, because you can't scale if you need to pay moderators to moderate everything. That's going to be a bottleneck. You have to think about that both from a business standpoint and from a scalability standpoint, and just from a more practical standpoint as well. If people, for example, are uploading videos, are they uploading full HD, super high res, ultra massive videos? Because that's going to kill even the most powerful cloud infrastructure, or you're just going to pay a lot of money. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be happy to actually demonstrate the project a little bit later. It's hard to show it on a screen. But did anyone have any questions? Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I love the section of what made you cry. And sharing those.
Thank you. Well, you just got to be honest. I always find these post-mortems are really valuable, what didn't work, because then you can avoid that. I hope that none of you run into these issues, or at least you're forewarned, and you can research and be like, oh, I need to do that.
What, if anything, did you have to revisit after you'd done your load testing?
So I discovered that my videos were actually loading very, very slowly. So I was using Vimeo. I tried out using Azure to host the videos, but it was quite expensive. And that's not a problem with Azure. Azure is designed for enterprise-grade loads and for handling very, very high reliability levels. It's not really designed to be the next TikTok. So what I eventually ended up using was DigitalOcean just to host the MP4 files.
That decision came about after you first ran the load testing.
Yes, exactly. I did that, but the load testing told me, hey, this is going to be really expensive. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm a single developer. I really can't afford that right now. But I'm pretty sure that Microsoft either is coming out with a streaming video product of some kind soon. I just haven't had time to investigate it yet. I just wanted something quick, so I used one that I knew would work. But the video files are a bit of a hassle. The advice I would give on specifically video is you have to have it in a content distribution network, a CDN. If it's not on a CDN, you're already sunk. The reason for that is because you don't want to be pulling a video file from North America in Australia. It takes too long. It can take thousands of milliseconds. By that time, your user is already gone. They're not going to stare at a learning bar. People have got very short attention spans today. I just want to stress that. Azure is meant for enterprise-grade data systems and things like that. Any other questions?
Great talk, by the way. I loved every moment.
Thank you very much.
I had a question around resiliency. So obviously you've got things that can fail. Did you do any work with Chaos Studio or any similar things to that to deal with outages, breaches, stuff like that in Azure?
I haven't done any work on resiliency. So the question was, have I looked at resiliency, Chaos Studio, things like that? I haven't really gotten to that stage of the project yet. One of the reasons I chose Azure is because it's well known to have very good grades of service level agreements. It's meant to be very reliable. That was kind of part of my decision making when I used it, but I really just haven't gone into that stage of the project yet. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I'm pretty confident that Azure will be able to handle the loads, provided I structure the project correctly. I don't really have to worry about it too much, but I do always say you should make decisions based on data, not on feelings and hunches. So I'll definitely be checking it out and seeing what happens. And one of the things I'm going to do is in my app, I'm going to have telemetry so that when people get 404s and pages aren't loading, it goes into Microsoft App Center and I can see bar charts. Oh, something's going on. Maybe have an alarm that goes on my phone, because you can fix things if you know about them. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
About MVU model update. Have you explored that, or did you consider sticking to MVU before?
So the question is, did I look at the MVU framework, which I'm not very familiar with? The reason that I didn't use anything more sophisticated than MVVM and fresh MVVM is quite simple. My app doesn't have a lot of data entry and doesn't need a lot of dynamically updating things. If I had done something with more heavy data entry, definitely I would have explored something like that. But for me, I found the XAML with normal bindings and entity framework, I'm really just showing people pages and dismissing pages. That's what it boils down to. My app doesn't really need anything more sophisticated like real-time updates or anything like that. There's not that tier of application. So it definitely is something I would explore if I had an app that had more intensive things like real-time updating things, for sure.
Yeah, I still
Yeah.
think PTSD from XML.
Oh, really? From XML? You know, a lot of people don't like XML, and it is true that it is a verbose, declarative language for developing user interfaces. That's true. I was very sad when Microsoft got rid of the XAML designer, but I find that when I'm designing the XAML, having the hot reload on my phone, I just change something and bang, it reloads it. I find that kind of replaces the designer for me, and it's not really that bad. A lot of people do just write the controls programmatically. They create them as new objects rather than using XAML. I can see why people would do that. So the bindings can be a little bit tortuous, but everything's there for a reason. If you invest the time to learn it, you'll do much better in the long run. But I know it can be boring to read, 100-page long documents. I tend to watch video tutorials these days. I find them a lot more engaging and interesting to watch. And it's like sitting next to like a really senior guy who knows what he's doing. I actually greatly prefer that to reading documentation. That's the way a lot more people are learning these days, is watching video tutorials of coders coding something that they want to code or something similar to what you want to do. Yeah, so thank you very much for your comments.